here, actually. If you want to come in and grab a seat, those who are still kind of wandering about, we're going to start the talk momentarily. I hope everyone did okay with the storm. I know it was really hard go even here, as distant as we were from the center of everything. But I really appreciate you making it out today on a Saturday too. And if you've not seen the current exhibition, this is the context for which and by which we've been inviting some really remarkable people. Last week we had Stanley Guntarski, who's writing a second book about Burroughs. And this week, I'm just delighted that for our Art Speak lecture, this is sponsored by Richard and Julia Rush Endowment, we are able to bring from New York, from Ithaca College where he teaches, but also writes extensively. We've got, of course, S. Alexander Reed, who goes by Alex to friends. So Alex has written a wonderful, more recent book on Laurie Anderson about her big science, and he'll be talking about that a bit. It's definitely worth picking up. It is with Oxford University Press, as was the book that preceded it, which is called Assimilate, which is the critical history of industrial music. He's a musician himself, remarkable scholar. We're thrilled to have him here. So Alex, with that, welcome.
All righty. All right, thank you. First of all, to Jade Dellinger and Lisa Murphy for inviting me to speak here. When Jade first created the Facebook event page for today's talk based on our conversations about what I'd be discussing, he gave it the perfectly good title, Laurie Anderson and William S. Burroughs, I versus You and Other Lessons. Now, my eyesight is terrible, and I hastily read this as Laurie Anderson and William S. Burroughs versus You, which I liked so much that I have in fact renamed the talk this. I like to think of it as a bit of aleatoric chance if we're thinking about Laurie Anderson and John Cage and that world, or if we're thinking about Burroughs and Geisen, we think of this as a cut-up as well. The title piece is nice and confrontational, and here's this photo of Anderson and Burroughs together. Apologies to John Giorno, who's been cropped out of this. That's his arm in the background right there. But if that's not confrontational enough for this title, we can go with this, where Laurie Anderson is shooting finger guns and Burroughs is shooting non-finger guns. Okay. Now, in our initial conversation, Jade sent me a quote from a Q&A that Laurie Anderson did last month with The Guardian. He said, I'm sure you caught her recent comment in The Guardian interview. In it, a fan asked Laurie Anderson about her connection with Burroughs, and she replied, the most important thing I learned from him was second person. I did some tours with him, and he was always going, you people, you think that. He wasn't talking like a writer does about I, or an essay about himself. He was talking about you. It was a fabulous device which I'd never really thought about, but he taught me how to do it, unquote. And this idea is at the heart of my talk today. As I explore its consequences, I'm mostly going to be dealing with Laurie Anderson's work, given that I spent a few years writing about it. But as a prelude to that, let's start by looking at Burroughs and grasping what Laurie Anderson means when she cites his penchant for the second person you. So, William S. Burroughs, if you don't know, was an author, artist, beatnik, subcultural icon, and raconteur who is famously fascinated with experimental writing, non-linearity of all kinds, homosexual desire, drugs, especially heroin, technology, magic, government conspiracy theories, Middle Eastern culture, language, cats, cowboys, lemurs, and gigantic science fiction bugs. You can see some of those here. There's more, and some of it's actually pretty dodgy, but those are the basics that we need to know about Burroughs for today. His first novel from 1953 was called Junkie, and in clinical, remorseless language, it flatly reports his own unadorned, unglamorous experience with opioid addiction. Now, he published it initially under the name William Lee, that you can see there. Lee is family name on his mother's side. Actually, he was descended from Robert E. Lee. His father grandfather invented the adding machine, Burroughs adding machine. So Southern Midwestern aristocracy, kind of. The book was marketed as fiction, but its main character, as portrayed in the third-person narrative, is also named William Lee. What's more, he returns to this William Lee character in his books many more times over the next 35 years. So, Junkie begins for Burroughs a long vexation over claims of fact versus fiction and first-person versus third-person identity. Exacerbating the weirdness in the case of Junkie is the book's coldness and lack of real interiority for its main character. On the page, William Lee takes little interest in and passes almost no judgment on his surrounding world or other people, on the past or the future, or money, or sex, or food, or himself. Junkie is a flat, cold narrative interspersed with factual lectures. In the ecological pattern of the drug addict, the narrator is reduced to a cipher in the crowd, and the use of first person is almost a mockery, wrote Alan Anson in the only contemporary book review that Junkie ever received. There is no transcendent self, merely a functionalist laundry list of actions. You aren't what you are here, but what you do. More recently, scholar Oliver Harris helps explain why any kind of human individuality in this book feels kind of like a sick joke. Quote, Junkie presents a dead society, a corpse-cold, one-dimensional realm as reduced to meaningless materiality as junkies are to their motiveless somatic needs. Burroughs closes any gap between Lee's private self and his junkie identity. There is no personality behind or outside. Unquote. And as Burroughs writes of his fellow druggies in the novel, they all looked alike somehow. They all looked like junk. Unquote. To cut a long story short, there are two developments that follow from here in the work of Burroughs. The first concerns that abject, gross materiality in the line, they all looked like junk, where junk is slang for heroin. Notably, he literalizes this metaphor, and indeed he tends to literalize metaphors across his entire career. It's one of his signature moves. And so the novels that follow, Naked Lunch, The Ticket That Exploded, Wild Boys, Port of Saints, they all become science fiction as a matter of course. That's not because they resemble Ursula K. Le Guin or Isaac Asimov, but because they portray a world where people identify and manufacture their objects of need, sex, drugs, technology, and in doing so, they become addicted and they're changed by these objects. They're infected, they're consumed, they're replaced in many cases by these objects. Addictive desire is a primordial building block like mud, protoplasm, or money. Everything boils down in Burroughs' work to its fundamental exchange rate, often literally. A world without some kind of need is no more thinkable to him than ideas without language. This is the through line joining the early realism of a book like Junkie to the utter weirdness of the later novels and artwork. And this idea, by the way, of language being central to all of this, and also it being that which infects you. Of course, this exhibit is called Language is a Virus, one of the famous joining phrases between Burroughs and Anderson. The second development in Burroughs' work follows from that first one. And here I'm coming back to the main subject of the talk, its sly use of the second person you. This shows up across Burroughs' career most often in subtle ways that you might not realize, because of the way that casual speech generalizes you as a synonym for I or we, or as some hypothetical someone. Indeed, Burroughs was a talker. If you recognize any feature of the man, it may well be his voice, featured on countless records, rock music guest features, and experimental tape recordings. Here's his voice.
There with the apes. Why don't you come over here with a board where you belong?
There we go. Another root of his conflating you was the first and third person writing, argues Oliver Harris, Another root of his conflating you with first and third person writing, argues Oliver Harris, was that so much of his style was developed through letters sent to Allen Ginsberg, Neil Cassidy, and Jack Kerouac. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, writing with an audience of one, a very known you. As you can see this here. The intimate circle was both subject matter and audience, says Steve Watson. And Harris affirms, it is no coincidence that the epistolary bond that weds the first person I to the second person you accords so precisely with the central relationships in the period of Junkie's writing. And at any rate, here's one example from Junkie. In 1937, weed was placed under the Harrison Narcotics Act. Narcotics authorities claim it is a habit-forming drug, that its use is injurious to mind and body, and that it causes the people who use it to commit crime. Here are the facts. Weed is positively not habit-forming. You can smoke weed for years, and you will experience no discomfort if your supply is suddenly cut off. Between author and reader, at least in 1959, it is likely that only one had been smoking weed for years. And reader, it was probably not you. And you can see the you right there. This funny I-you switch fictionally creates a fast bond between reader and author. And part of what facilitates it, part of what facilitates it is that cold clinical language otherwise surrounding it. Here, of course, you're dealing with the 1937 Harrison Narcotics Act, but soon you realize that you're implicated in all of this, committing crimes alongside William Lee, or book in hand, at least pruriently aiding and abetting them. You may ask yourself, well, how did I get here? A few years later, the book The Ticket That Exploded discards narrative and famously shifts into a paranoid advice column. Carry a tape recorder with you and record all the ugliest, stupidest things, Burroughs writes, turning his own past tense first-person experience into your future second-person experience. And decades later, we're still at it with 1987's The Western Lands. At the book's heartfelt climax, Burroughs' stand-in, William Lee, appears again, now as an old, sad writer who has lost his cat, named Smoker. The old writer canvassed the neighborhood with Smoker's picture. He offered a $50 reward. Finally, he bought a wishing machine. Directions for use are simple. You put a picture, nail clipping, hair, or anything connected with the subject of your wish between two copper plates activated by a patented magnetic device that runs on standard current. Then you make your wish. Notice here the way that you comes to stand in for the character of William Lee, himself an avatar of the author. And this shift, as before, relies on colloquial, everyday linguistic uses of the word you know? But you'll also notice that it's situated in the context of machine instructions involving magnetic devices at standard current, and therefore, again, hides under the cloak of official, technical, industrial language. The subjectivity of I and he are laundered by objectivity, instruction manuals into that of you. And you don't even notice it happening. We're all the same stuff as each other, though. The same gooey stuff as the world itself is. We look through our eyes, at our eyes, from the inside and outside as subject, object, and setting. This is what Burroughs is getting at when he says we all look like junk. Everything in the world is made of the same carbon. This is the I-you switch. Elsewhere, I call it doing, not telling. And I want to think a little bit about not merely its mechanics, which we've already seen in Burroughs, but its uses and effects, both in relating on the one hand and on the other, erasing differences between a given you and a given I. As I pivot to Laurie Anderson now, I'm going to be thinking specifically about these differences in terms of gender and sexuality, right at the moment in her career when she became a public figure, a pop star, a brand. So let's turn the page. It was fall of 1978 that Laurie Anderson, at age 31, first read Burroughs' work. Having made a minor name for herself in the underground performance art world of downtown Manhattan, she'd scored an invitation to perform at the Nova Convention, a 3-day celebration of Burroughs' work, newly reappreciated in the social and aesthetic context of New York City's booming punk scene. And we actually have a program from the Nova Convention and a record for it over there in the case there. Other performers at the event include Patti Smith, Frank Zappa, John Cage, Merce Cunningham, John Giorno, and Anne Waldman. Anderson, who mixed with that crowd, had heard of Burroughs, but had never spent time with his writing. And so in preparation for the fest, she wolfed down Naked Lunch and The Ticket That Exploded and immediately latched onto them. even to the degree that she would later quote passages from these books in her songs as uncredited Easter eggs. At the time, she was developing a stage piece that would eventually become her famous work, United States, parts 1 through 4. And she's doing a part 5 in November in Manchester, England, by the way. When it was finally staged in 1981, the massive work was 6 hours long and riveting. This live show became the international toast of the hipster avant-garde, and importantly, it produced a single, the 8-minute wonder called Oh Superman. She initially released this single on a tiny Manhattan label, but after it earned airplay on the UK BBC show by John Peel, Warner Brothers signed her and released the single. It peaked at number 2 in England, and she went on to record the hit album Big Science, about which I wrote my whole darn book. Okay, so some of you may be familiar with Big Science and its aesthetics of futuristic sleekness. This album, importantly, was how the world came to know Laurie Anderson. It set the terms by which she entered the wider public sphere as a pop artist. But recall that there were years of preparation, experimentation, and self-making that preceded its 1982 release. Not merely the years from 1978's Nova Convention, but for fully a decade prior to that, Anderson had been performing, sculpting, photographing, printing, writing, and screen-making. Bear in mind that the world in which she did this also changed radically in the lead up to 1982. I want to start with what critics called this album's facelessness, its bodilessness, and its nowlessness. Its lyrics are atemporal, incorporeal, where any sense of I remains unlocatable, and indeed where Anderson herself seems absent as a person, perhaps even more present as an android. One thesis that Big Science offers is that our creations, categories like technology, data, big business, transportation, industry, have gotten so big that we can no longer control them. They have minds of their own, and that in the face of their magnitude, we as individuals risk disappearing like stars twinkling into the sunrise. And the anti-human scale of Big Science has profound consequences for gender and sexuality. Facelessness all but precludes love, and where there are no bodies, there may seem to be no sex, which music journalists in 1982 found very strange indeed. Across the record, Anderson may draw our attention repeatedly to little slices of here and now, but overt romance, overt eroticism are nowhere to be found on this record. And in a music otherwise so worldly, perceptive, and gender-aware, these silences can strike one as being suggestive. In his 1992 book, John Howell prods Anderson about her alleged androgyny and bizarrely emphasizes, in her mid-40s, she lives alone and worries about the creeping isolation. And fan forums buzzed at her being, quote-unquote, married to her work. You can see that right there. Most telling, biographer Rosalie Goldberg reports, I would often ask friends what questions they would ideally like to have answered in a volume on Laurie Anderson. More than once they responded, what is she really like? And this passage underscores both audiences' failure to categorize Anderson and the frankly creepy way that vexed them. What this is pointing to, of course, is that as she's told People magazine, a lot of people assume I am gay. This vexation arises because standard modes of pop listening rely upon and reinforce audiences' sexually pre-scripted engagement with performers. Now it's 2024, and a few comments are warranted about the album's legibility of gender and sexuality. First, decades later, its erotics might seem a little clearer than circa 1982 sources would suggest. One reason is that the last 40 years of dialogue around gender have equipped listeners with more nuanced sensibilities, and insider audiences can extrapolate big meanings from minimal signs. So a little line like on the album when she says, linger on over here, from let X equal X, line like that can hold sensual galaxies. Or if every man is for himself, as she sings in the title track Big Science, then we can ask, are women, in contrast, for a communal good or for each other? Furthermore, a lot of listeners who related to this album in gendered ways may have been functionally barred from its early male-dominated discourse. Most of Big Science's 1980s coverage was by men, and even their most well-intentioned efforts echoed the biases of pop sexism. By exception, the musician-activist Marcia Deal reinforces this rule, reviewing the record in a 1982 issue of a publication called Sojourner, the New England Women's Journal of News. And so I'm framing this explicitly as an exception, right? And this is also my favorite review at the time of hers. She says, "The music, although electronically produced, is the most soothing since Kate Gardner's. In fact, it shares a majestic, primal, organic lushness. That must have something to do with their being women. The drones of harmonic fourths and fifths make me feel like a medieval nun in a sauna. But then, every once in a while, a rhythmic spritz will surprise me." Holiness, right? Okay, second, Laurie Anderson's private relationship to gender and sexuality is none of our damn business. I am not a biographer. I am unconcerned with her lived experience. Instead, I want to consider how her art cultivated new strategies over time for representing gender and embodiment. In particular, toward the late 1970s, Anderson's art and writing developed what I think of as an anti-public sexuality. This was part of, and I think really the instigation of a larger process out of which her now recognizable style emerges, and it continues. I don't know if you heard her new album that came out just last month, Amelia, but this is an album about technology, about flight, about struggle. It is also about gender, but in these very sort of underground ways. By anti-public, I mean a sexuality visible in silhouette, but not in detail. Implied by desire's shadow, but with desire so unnamed as to indicate preemption or pushback. And I say this aware of the inevitable misjudgments and oversights and biases that I am going to bring to this as a cisgender man. My intention is to help hold space for a sensitive conversation around these developments in Anderson's early work. And the third thing about all this is that the sexual illegibility of Big Science is itself a denial and a critique of culture's mandate on women's sexual accessibility, especially in like the pop culture world. Through a queer lens, it can also critique the mandate that one perform the expectations of one's assigned gender or presumed gender. And you can see the need for critiques like these by way of culture's total non-interest in the sexual legibility of works by comparable male artists, like Brian Eno, Ken Nordine, The Last Poets, Spalding Gray, Gil Scott-Heron, and others. No one ever asks them about their sexuality. So this stems from centuries of cultural practice that have synonymized cis masculinity with mental domains and not bodily ones, and also with authority as opposed to access. So Anderson's early art, the stuff from before 1978, is not so austere as this. But the huge stage and audience and budget of Big Science demanded new and careful management of gendered expectations. As soon as money came into it, she says, things changed. The great musicologist Susan McClary historicizes this, quote, "In order to balance out these various tensions, Anderson assumed an androgynous persona while working on the United States. Her androgyny downplays her sexuality, which, given the history of women in performance, always threatens to become the whole show." And that's really important here. It's vital to understand how different the coldly monetized gaze of the 1980s was from the warm insularity of the burgeoning 1970s Soho scene from which she emerged. In those early days, quote, "There was a big party every night," Anderson recalled in 2017. "A lot of sex and drugs and rock and roll. Well, not so much rock and roll, but sex and drugs for sure, lots," unquote. In the first half of the 1970s, when loft concert audiences were mostly her fellow artists, Anderson's work was accordingly frank. Here begins a public negotiation of gender presentation and desire, and I promise that we're going to get back to the IU switch and back to Burroughs. But bear with me. In 1972, she wrote down her dreams and published a book of them called October 1972. October 31st reads, "In my imagination, I secretly like myself." And if this raw self-deprecation seems uncharacteristic of the Laurie Anderson you might know, then October 11th's entry is outright unthinkable in the world of Big Science. Yeah. From 1972 to 1974, she performed a series of vignettes called For Instance, of which 15 were anthologized. Irrespective of any autobiographical status, this matter-of-fact writing relates a first orgasm, trysts while traveling, a coldly written abortion narrative, same-sex fantasies. In these texts, starkness prevails, made more real by virtue of their not all taking up concerns of gender and sexuality. These topics are instead part of a larger life, a more three-dimensional self. Especially in the aftermath of the sexual revolution, it was remarkable and political to present one's sexuality as unremarkable and apolitical. Does that make sense? Yes, good. Anderson's artist statement accordingly begins, "For instance, is an attempt to get back into the present. Much of it involves pine trees and horses, and nature and sex," unquote. If trees and sex are the stuff of the present, then their absence in big science is key to its nowlessness. By the mid-1970s, her work reveals an emerging but kind of reluctant critical engagement with misogyny. "It was a strange decade. I've forgotten it already," she mused at the end of 1979. "A lot of horrible things have happened to me, but I erased them quickly." A 1974 roundtable in Art Right magazine asks, "Do you think there is a shared sensibility in the work of female artists? And how would you describe or dismiss it?" These questions were in the zeitgeist. "Why have there been no great women artists?" was the title of a 1971 article by Linda Nochlin. And "Why have there been no great women composers?" asked Pauline Oliveros in the opening line of a New York Times editorial a year earlier. Anderson wavers. Quote, "I'm not equipped to analyze the political, social, economic, cultural, psychoanalytic, and sexual factors that bear on the question, is there such a thing as women's art? About the only thing I can say about sex and art is, there are men, there are women, and there is art. The men and women who put art first are artists, and the men and women who put sex first are sexists." Anderson's sentiments have changed since then. Her attitude, though, in 1974 was common. In the same roundtable, Nancy Graves says, "Gender has nothing at all to do with art." This moment is transitional in Anderson's work because it because in contrast to storytelling's mediated distance, here she's asked by others publicly to stake out a specific politicized sexual identity. It indicates the start of a reckoning in her work with its own reception. And as her audience grew, she could no longer act like her art happened in a void. Just a few weeks after that issue of Art Right dropped, she gave a performance called Tales from the Vienna Woods at the ICA in Boston. According to the promoter, quote, "She was mercilessly heckled throughout by Robert Horvitz, one of the most knowledgeable and sophisticated critics in Boston." That guy. God knows why he felt the need to do that to her at the time. It remains a mystery, unless he had a thing for her and this was his way of getting attention. Unquote. Publicly invasive and gendered experiences like this were concurrent with a slow but steady pullback of overt sexuality in Anderson's art. Her December 1974 film, Dear Reader, eschews the autobiography that she was known for at the time. And we also have drawings from this film here as well. It began, as she says, with a bedroom and 2 bathrobes that you see from the waist down. They come together, and then a foot comes up, and a slipper drops down to the carpet. Then the camera pans to the window, and the wind is blowing through it as 9 calendar pages blow off. That's sex in the 40s. Not exactly explicit. Unquote. By relegating sex off-screen and to the reproductive, Dear Reader critiques respectable sexuality, revealing its absence of pleasure. It raises questions about just whose sexuality was compulsorily respectable and by whose mandate. But if one moment proves presciently critical of public sexuality in Anderson's early art, it's the photo text piece, Fully Automated Nikon, Object, Objection, Objectivity. Despite bearing little resemblance to big science, This piece makes a particular artistic move that over the next decade becomes frequent and ultimately proves iconic. She says, I decided to shoot pictures of men who made comments to me on the street. I had always hated this invasion of my privacy, and now I had the means of my revenge. As I walked along Houston Street with my fully automated Nikon, I felt armed, ready. I passed a man who muttered, "Wanna fuck?" This was standard technique. The female passes and the male strikes at the last possible moment, forcing the woman to backtrack if she should dare to object. I wheeled around, furious. Did you say that? He looked around, surprised, then defiant. Yeah, so what the fuck if I did? I raised my Nikon, took aim, began to focus. His eyes darted back and forth. An undercover cop? Click. Anderson's trigger pulling is cathartic and empowering. It exposes and undercuts a gross but all too familiar violation, refusing to let others dictate the terms of her mere being. The photographs are a warning and an APB, as in, have you seen these men? Anderson obscures the men's eyes, to which when I first saw this piece, I said, no, reveal the abusers, name names. Robert Horvitz. But by masking them, if on the one hand, she prevents us from humanizing these men, on the other, she also prevents us from tidily villainizing them and relaxing into the certainty that this work is about someone else. The men's anonymity can incite an uncanny identification, leaving the viewer asking, ugh, is this somehow me? All this to say nothing about how, by viewing these pictures, we might take troubling interest in, if not pleasure in, Anderson's having been verbally assaulted. And in this triangulation, agency is everywhere and nowhere. Are we in the position of Anderson? In the position of these men? Are we watching it? Are we in the position of the camera? Who's the I? Who's the you? As with Burroughs, subject and object, I and you come into slippery mutual orbit. Fully automated Nikon dates from 1973, which means that Anderson's narrative is not one of unidirectional progress. It's not just that she takes this on as the 70s go on only, but instead she plants an idea with it, topically and tactically, that would grow increasingly significant in her work. Her vital invention is the move away from regaling an audience with what she experienced and toward subjecting them to that same experience. In doing this, she explodes our position as viewers and listeners, and we are no longer passively just ourselves. If traditional first-person pop encourages both compliant spectatorship or maybe identification with the I of the singer, then Anderson's second-person artwork encourages, first, active participation as the indicated you, and second, identification with this eyeless indicator. And so more the camera than Anderson herself. So it puts you in the position of the world that situates you. When she says that you're going to undergo what she went through, then you are now in whatever situation she undergoes. And in these works, Anderson is not in the spotlight, but is herself that spotlight on us. And this makes for a weird refiguring of space. It resonates with her conflating bodies and motion in rooms in songs like Walking and Falling and Born Never Asked, and in exhibits like Songs for the Night Driver. Here, she puts the audience in the passenger seat and she shows films, and you can see that your shadow is cast on the wall there as the audience, so you become part of the art. You can in fact see this clip here. Songs for the Night Driver is an experience which is neither logical nor coherent. Sounds, rhythms, and images are poetically orchestrated into a strange and unfathomable whole. Anderson places the viewer, you, right in the middle of the situation, which lyrically disorients the fettered mind. You, as a museum visitor, are invited to settle into the driver's seat, and you let Laurie Anderson get into your head. There are little versions of this as well. This is the famous hand phone table, where the only way to hear the rumbling noise or the sound that this table broadcasts is to sit at it, put your elbows on it, put your hands on your ears, and let the bones of your arms conduct the sound from the table's vibrations up into your eardrums. This is currently up at Mass MoCA. If you The flipping of I and you is furthermore not just like a noun-like state of affairs, it's a verb-like action. It renders Anderson elusive and in control. She's above us, both domineering and puckish, as with minimal effort she changes our worlds, our characters, our perspectives. And this too is a gendered strategy. As musicologist Simon Frith writes, Laurie Anderson has to keep redefining both her performing space and her performing narrative to take charge of her situation. Okay, now going back to the start of my talk, Anderson credits William S. Burroughs with teaching her this nimble art, a master of making you a toxic, hilarious, and mysterious blend of accusation, conspiracy, and camaraderie. He understood how to play with the idea of audiences and how an audience identifies with a narrator. Unquote. But that's 1978 that she meets him, that she reads his work. As fully automated an icon of 1973 shows, among other pieces, she was in fact already flipping I and you long before she read Naked Lunch. Another early seed that's kind of fun. Over there, you'll see one of her earliest artworks in the case. This is a book called The Package. This is allegedly a children's book about a package that gets lost in the mail and has global adventures as it travels. And in the copy from this book, in the advertising copy that she gave to her alumna magazine at Barnard, she has this little quote. One day, my 5-year-old sister asked, Laurie, which one of us is dreaming? So this is 1971, so this stuff goes way back for her, right? Anyhow, that's why Burroughs so affected her, I think. It wasn't that he presented her with some new idea, but he instead articulated a power that she had already beheld. If the old writerly advice is show, don't tell, then this IU switch is doing, not telling. The audience no longer looks in on Anderson experiencing the world, but we now behold ourselves having an experience that she inflicts. This positions Anderson as the world, like I said, decentralized, superpowered, and able to direct our gaze. Beyond its power to overturn misogyny, she uses this technique for 100 different ends throughout her career, and I could give lots of examples. But let me close by bringing this back to the 1978 Nova Convention, where she and Burroughs meet for the first time. Here's the program there. At that November 30th, 1978 performance... hang on. She debuts this vignette. All right, go ahead and give us a listen.
I was on a twin-engine plane from Milwaukee to New York City, and just over LaGuardia, one of the engines conked out, and we started to drop straight down, flipping over and over. Then the engine died, and we've been completely out of control. New York City started to get taller and taller. A voice came over the intercom and said,
Our pilot has informed us that we are about to attempt a crash landing. Please extinguish all cigarettes. Place your tray tables in an upright position. Your captain says, please do not panic. Captain says, place your head in your hands. Captain says, put your knees to your chin. Captain says, put your hands in your eyes. Captain says, put your hands on your head. Put your hands on my knees. This is your captain. Have you lost your dog?
That last line, have you lost your dog, by the way, is lifted directly from Burroughs' 1962, The Ticket That Exploded. But here, her use of the first person, its differentiation from the third person pilot, and details like Milwaukee mark this specifically as a 1970s text for Laurie Anderson. They furthermore render her doubly vulnerable. She lived through and relives this trauma for our amusement. Compare this with the doing not telling IU switch in the opening track of 1982's big science called From the Air.
This is your captain.
to attempt a crash landing, please extinguish all cigarettes. Place your tray tables in their upright position. Your captain says, put your head on your knees. Captain says, put your head in your hands. Captain says, put your hands on your head, put your hands on your hips. This is your captain. We are going down. We're all going down together.
Having trimmed away the story's narrative, she stages its power relations in real time, conscripting you, the audience member, under her authority, marking your doom. This is the philosophical gambit on which, with this opening track of her debut album, she predicates her entire pop career and is introduced to 1 million people. In doing, not telling, Anderson recreates memory not as her own past, but as the audience's present. This powerful practice tilts the ratio of input inspiration to output experience. And again, this stylistic move developed to safeguard a private selfhood and sexuality as part of a long negotiated pivot away from the candid self-presentation of her early career. It is preemptive both against the male gaze and against the reduction of women's art to the mere fact of sexual difference. Bearing in mind the timeline of Anderson's stardom, I also want to recognize that doing not-tellings can have deflective power that can afford an artist greater private space and greater public leeway in negotiating the challenges of fame. Now, it's a talk for another day, but I'd love to turn this one more time back to Burroughs. I want to poke at the idea that his relationship to his gayness runs quite parallel to Anderson's relationship with womanhood. And I'd love to trace that IU switch in his work and see its shape over time, what it avails and what it covers up. But none of that for now. The time being, I want to turn my gaze around the Bob Rauschenberg Gallery, and I see hallmarks of this move in some of the art that is here. This IU switch can take up, they each take it up in their own way. Over there you'll see Anderson's handbook, which if you have a look at it, the pages, in order to see what it contains, you have to turn yourself, just like she did when writing it. So there's something physical involved in that. And to behold Burroughs' shotgun pieces, you can see some of these have been shot through. In fact, some of these have been shot through with a cannon, Jade was telling me earlier. A homemade cannon that shot candlepin bowling balls. And that's why that sarcophagus there has been split into two. You'll find that for me, you'll find that these pieces might entail feeling like he's almost shooting at you, right? The pieces are tattered and victimized, and there seems something accusatory about that. And so ask yourself what else you might find. In what new and strange ways can these two artists triangulate, redouble, accuse, recruit, sympathize with, frame, newly christen, or otherwise point to you? All right, thank you very much. And if we want to chat, we can chat. I'm happy to answer questions or have conversations, or if you just want to go out and see the art, that's great too.
Anyone have questions? Can you, I'll start, can you talk a little bit more about Burroughs' influence on music and musicians in general?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, and also, things like heavy metal.
Yeah.
I mean, in your book, actually, Assimilate, the second chapter is about William S. Burroughs.
Yeah.
And makes that deep connection in really beautiful ways.
Yeah. Burroughs, it's interesting. Both he and Laurie Anderson's career kind of parallel in some ways in that they were active. They were doing things that were really interesting for quite a while. They each had probably fully a decade of putting art into the world, putting writing into the world before the glitterati really noticed, right? So Burroughs, of course, starts he starts writing in the 40s, really even earlier, but his first published work comes out in the very late 50s, very early 1960s, and it isn't until the kind of psychedelic moment in the late 1960s that the subculture has said, ooh, this is a guy really, really worth paying attention to. And some of these earliest influences are, the fact that some people credit him with, in fact, coining the term heavy metal. Steely Dan, the band, takes their name from an object in one of his books. And then you get a lot of younger artists who are interested in his technique. Specifically with Brian Geisen, he works on what they call the cut-up technique, which is where, here, let's do this. You're going to take multiple pages, and you can rip them vertically like this, right? And then when you reorder them from different pages, you get all sorts of what seems on the surface to be nonsense, he says, right? But, here we go. So from the talk that I just said, I'm going to say, indeed of aleatoric stance, if may well be cage, and that world features language, cats, cowboys, photo of Anderson shooting not finger guns. Right? So you can do these little cut-ups, but in the world of recording, right, where you're working with tape, this becomes a whole new thing. It isn't even really new. I mean, of course, Walter Ruttmann was doing this with film recording in 1930, and Pierre Schaeffer started doing this with musique concrète right after World War II as well, right? Once you have all this material that you can cut up, once sound is itself an actual stuff, an actual material, that's not an event that happens in the air, but it's something on tape or on vinyl, then you can apply the cut-up technique to sound. And he would do this with tape recorders, and he also imbued this with a lot of occultic significance, right? He believed that if you went and you recorded, let's say, a situation, a diner that you often eat at, and you hear people, I don't know, getting into a fight there, you can go and then play that back somewhere else, and it might cause a fight somewhere else, right? He really believed that when you sampled something, it wasn't merely the sound, but you were getting somehow at its essence, right? And this actually, I never thought about it this way before, but you can connect that back to his notion that we're all made of the same stuff, right? If we're all made of junk, or if we're all made of language, or if we're all made of goo, then temporality also fits into this mold. So what you can do in a diner, you can do in a fire station, you can do in Tangiers, you can do in Paris, you can do at a gun range. All these things, as far as he's concerned, are all sort of fluid. And his writing and all of its sort of nonsensicality is interested in unlocking this fluidity. So you can do this literally with like tape. And some rock stars at the time, like Mick Jagger, meets with Burroughs, and Bowie meets with Burroughs, and they're really interested in like how you can create sound collages, and you can actually hear some of this influence on Mick Jagger's soundtrack to Invocation of My Demon Brother, the short film by Kenneth Anger, rest in peace, from last year. But so there's this like sonic connection, right? But then there's also this like connection of Burroughs was into non-linearity and drugs and magic and all this proto-psychedelic stuff back, let's say, in 59, 60, and so by 1968, 69, it's very, very cool to be, hanging out with him, and so Rolling Stone gets him to like be the interviewee for a bunch of these people. Basically, he kind of gets elected and re-celebrated, and this really happens for the rest of his life, right? He lives in a bunch of different places up until the mid-1960s, late 1960s, leading kind of an off-the-grid, weird outlaw life, literary outlaw, as they like to call him. But once he becomes sort of a fixture of the pop culture by the late 1960s, early 1970s, once he becomes cool, he's permanently cool, right? So he's sort of enshrined. And then, as you get into the 80s and 90s, you get Laurie Anderson working with him. The industrial music scene gets a hold of him. Ministry records a single with him in 1992. All sorts of cool stuff like that. So his influence is pervasive, right? He becomes just this sort of generalized media icon. And because he was never only a writer, because he was never only an artist and never only a recording artist, he also fits in well with this kind of flux. He himself wasn't like a fluxin, but he fits in well with this Fluxus idea where like the folks like Yoko Ono, George Masciunas were all saying, well, there's really not much difference between poetry and theater and film and cooking and everyday life, right? So that's part of his influence on music. It wasn't that he himself was a musician as such. I don't really know of any records where he is performing or singing really. but all the musicians, who were a kind of a hipster cast, all wanted to work with him. So, I showed his what is it, Dead City Radio, is that the name of the record? Almost there it is. Dead City Radio. John Cale of Velvet Underground, is producing half the tracks on this, and he does a record with Kurt Cobain in 1994, before Cobain dies. So everybody wanted to work with him, basically, and that sort of by association and by incidence makes him his own little version of a rock star. And Laurie Anderson, again, she herself is multidisciplinary as well, right? She actually talks about herself as being a sculptor. Her initial training is in sculpture, and so she's doing works where she's taking cut up texts and weaving them into pot holders and into quilts and things like that, or she'll. A lot of her early stuff is in traditional sculpture, but then of course she's also drawing, and she's writing poetry and publishing stories and doing storytelling and making films, and she's also someone who's really going to be blurring those lines. There's no sense in either case that you have to stick to your lane, and that's, I think, one thing that they really probably admired in one another.
Even on Jack White's new album, there's Burroughs' voice.
Oh, interesting. I'll have to hear that. Yeah. Go ahead.
I've heard that Laurie Anderson was married to Lou Reed.
Yes.
How did that marriage affect her art?
Oh, that's a great question. So she and Lou Reed got together, I think, in the late 1990s. I could be a year or two off on this, so feel free to fact check me and correct me. I think they got together in the late 1990s. She and he had both orbited around the wider New York City scene, and he originally was from, I think, upstate New York, near Rochester. Again, I could be wrong on this, maybe Buffalo. But as far as how it affected her art, I mean, by that point in his career, he had reached kind of a calm, right? He makes these kind of enfant terrible records in the starting in the late 60s with, actually starting in the mid-60s, Velvet Underground, and then into the 1970s. But by the time they get together, he's kind of in this sort of elder statesman of weirdness category. And I'm not sure if they're affecting each other's art in radical, fundamental ways, but they are certainly finding ways to be in dialogue with one another. I think that her work after they get together, so first of all, he plays on some of her records. He plays on Homeland, her 2010 album, I think, is here on that. And he toured with her. He, in fact, played a show in Florida with her in 2011. But there's a real sense of gentleness and dialogue. She gets really interested in themes of love and life and death. And actually, here's my answer to your question. So she makes this movie called Heart of a Dog in 2015. Have you seen this film? Okay, it's a beautiful, beautiful film. And it's ostensibly a meditation on her dog, Lola Bell. And she makes this movie kind of out of grief after the passing of her dog. And it affords her a lot of opportunities to talk about September 11th and her dog's reaction to that, and the entire notion that to a dog you never have to look up at the sky and sort of see the wider world, and how sort of that changed on September 11th. She uses it, as she always does, as an axis to talk about a lot of things. She talks about her relationship with her mother, who had also passed. But I remember seeing this film, and then Lou Reed died quite shortly after that. I think that's the chronology, or maybe he died. He dies right around this time. She doesn't really mention him at all in the film. I don't want to psychoanalyze her. I'm not a biographer, but to me it seems very, very likely that if she's making this film, which is meditating on the death of her dog and the death of her mother, as she is very likely aware that her husband is dying, that one thing could be standing in for another in this case. And so I would recommend seeing that film and kind of seeing it as a real thoughtful meditation on mortality. Her latest album, Amelia, which is again ostensibly about Amelia Earhart, with whom I shared a birthday. But It's also an album about legacy, right? Toward the end of the record, she's really starting to ask, ooh boy, how am I, Amelia Earhart, going to be remembered? You know, is this all just going to go down and be lost in the sea? It's really hard not to hear that as, you know, she is 77 years old now, maybe 76. But it's really hard not to hear that as something autobiographical. I'm not going to say X means Y in this case, but I think that we can hear these resonances for sure. And I think that Lou Reed gets her thinking about that. And certainly their life together, you know, you can see she's making lush, beautiful, illustrative, in some cases kind of rock-driven, you know, songs during that era from, let's say, 98 to 2015. But also the way that he ushers her into thinking about late style, as Edward Said would call it, mortality, basically confronting the end. I think that might be part of it.
About Lou's voice as it continues,
Yeah.
actually. She's been working in Australia.
Yeah.
And
This is the AI thing, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
I think that also ties into her November project that you were talking about, United States 5.
Yeah.
There is a drawing in the show that's related to ARC that is at the front here. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and also, again, she's continuing to use Lou somehow through
Yeah.
AI.
Yeah, so I mentioned that Big Science is this album about our creations becoming bigger than we can control, right? If you know anything about neural networks and how they work, then you know that we don't really know how they work, right? This is one of the funny things, is we create neural networks by saying, here's an input that we have, here's an output that we want, that we have, can you figure out all the steps in between? And the computer says, I can make this, and you give it enough models, and it eventually figures out a way to do it. And that way, whether it's winning at a chess game, or whether it's figuring out what word is most likely to come next in a large language model, is very, that way is an understanding tool that only the computer has, that we ourselves are not really going to be able to parse together. And so that's an idea of distributive intelligence, just like she's talking about in 1982 on Big Science, right? And so she gets really interested in AI in the early days. These days, I want to say that there are some really, really important debates about AI and art that are mostly separate from her concerns with it, that give me some real pause and concern about AI and art. But her interest in it is one of saying, you know, what does it mean to let non-human intelligences attempt to create art? And she's really critical about that in really interesting ways, especially, again, during this like 80s, 90s moment when, I mean, to some extent, doing a cut-up is AI art, right? You're saying, what happens when you put these things together? And I didn't do this, I didn't author this cut-up, but you know, you're doing that. I mean, collage is also this, right? So we go all the way back to, I don't know, Hieronymus Bosch. But what she's done in Australia, though, is she's now worked with this AI think tank there, where they have taken all of her writings and all of Lou Reed's writings, and they've put them into a large language model. They put them into a database, and they've crunched all the likelihoods of what words are most likely to follow with other words. I'm sure that they've bolstered it with other ingredients, because you really need really billions, maybe even trillions of words to get a good LLM up and running. And they're going to have probably 100,000 to 200,000 at most if you put them together. But the point is that you can now go onto this website and you can create Laurie Anderson texts or Lou Reed style texts, and you can give it a prompt and say, what would Laurie Anderson say about visiting the Cathedral of St. John the Divine? And then it would cough up something that sounds pretty Andersonian, or something that sounds like Lou Reed. Yep. And she talks about how this is one of her little ways of letting him live on. I think it's in the interview where someone says, ooh, do you think that this allows him really to live on? And she's like, no, we're not idiots. Burroughs is a mystic, right? Burroughs believed that, you know, sound can affect magic. And like Laurie Anderson has spirituality and mysticism and Buddhism, but like she's an intelligent, savvy, science-minded person, right? So she's not mistaking this for actual Lou Reed, but she understands the aesthetic and emotional value of having a little bit of this to keep on. And one of the things that she enjoys is the ability to blend their texts together. And I know that they in fact wrote and contributed to each other's texts in their later works as well.
Can you talk a little bit about your music?
Oh, sure, yeah. My degree is in composition, and I started off making classical music. I was telling Jade earlier, I grew up in a house where pop music was forbidden, basically. And I actually encountered Laurie Anderson's music at a very, very young age. I heard Big Science when I was 8 years old because a teacher's aide. So in 3rd grade, they put you in spelling groups, or at least they put me in spelling groups. Here I am doing the IU switch. They put me in a spelling group, and they have 20 kids in the class, right? And they put 10 in the group that they call, I don't know, the bears. And they put 5 over here in the giraffes, and they put 5 over here in the elk, or whatever it is. And those are the names that they use. But you look around the class and you know exactly what these groups are doing, right? In terms of the sort of bell curve of this. Anyhow, I was in one of the groups, and we had the teacher's aide working with us, and she showed up as this woman named Janet Borgeson. She's now a professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology. She ended up getting a PhD in philosophy after this, but she was probably 21 at the time. And she sat us down and she said, okay, you need to learn these words, you need to learn how to spell these words by the end of the year, but what we're going to do is we're going to write poetry, and we're going to make art, and we're going to listen to music. And so she brought in paintings by Georgia O'Keeffe and Jean Miro and things like that. And she exposed us, among other things, to Laurie Anderson's music. So I was an 8-year-old, and I had never heard pop music before. And she played for me, actually, From the Air, the opening track off of Big Science. And I was like, oh, this is great. This is how pop is supposed to sound. And of course, that's not really how pop sounds. But at any rate, I spent a long time kind of making mostly sort of gritty, dark, gothic, noisy, industrial music as like a pop musician. That was my gig throughout grad school. Put out some records. We were on MTV once, things like that. But this was like 2000 or so, when I was real young and pretty. And then I've kind of focused a little bit more on slightly artier fare since then. I have a noise project called Anaerobic, and I have a pop band these days called Seeming, and I've also done some work for commercials and soundtracks and stuff like that. I do not purport that it's anything special. I would love for it to achieve all the things that some of these artists are able to achieve. Maybe next time around. Yeah.
Very good.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's worth checking out. A lot of it's on YouTube.
Yeah. I mean, I've the Seeming records in particular, Seening. I've gotten to work with some really neat people. I got to work with a Japanese noise artist, Meyersbau, and I got to work with a guy named Bill Drummond, who was in a band called the KLF. If you remember the song 3 a.m. Eternal from 1991, it was a global hit. And do some really kind of odd things with them, but this is culturally marginal stuff. Yeah. I mean, the margins are where the interesting stuff happens, right? But you don't hear about them for the most part. Oh, thank you all so much.